No, one of the things you point out in your book is with Google, you and I can have an argument. I can go to Google and try and find something that supports my argument. You can do much the same thing. Talk to us about that.
Well, Google is really based on pleasing the customer. And this has been both its strength and its weakness, that depending on how a question is formulated, if Google thinks you're a bigot, if the algorithm thinks you're a bigot, it'll give you bigoted answers. If it thinks you believe in equality and justice for all, it will give you more mainstream answers. So the algorithm itself is really neutral, and this puts Google in a difficult position. After all, should a search engine really be enabling people who are using it for bad purposes? But the alternative is for Google then to become the arbiter of what is good and what is bad. And that could be as bad or worse than Google giving bigots bigoted answers.
So what is the answer?
I think the answer is for people to become more aware of how algorithms like Google's work and to acquire practice in more intelligent searching. This is a skill that comes only with time. I could give a lecture on smart Google searching, and it might be useful to people, and certainly reference librarians know all about that. And very often it's much better to ask a reference librarian than to search. But I would say that, as with everything else, success in a search really comes with practice, and with conscious practice, deliberate practice, seeing what small changes will do to the results, getting inside the mind of the algorithm, treating it not as an all-purpose oracle, but as a not entirely dependable narrator of reality. And once you have that skeptical attitude, saying that this is just a machine, this is just a system, and it behaves weirdly, once you step back from that, then search becomes something very different. It becomes something that you practice, something that you improve. But that's just a matter of time. The big problem is that Google is very good at conveying an illusion of authority. That's how they make their money. That's the basis of getting people to see advertising. And the trick is to be able to use it for what it's worth without being taken in by that premise.
It's not just Google. Social media platforms are also using algorithms to determine what you see. A few years ago, Facebook was in hot water for revealing it had secretly manipulated how many positive and negative posts that about 500,000 users saw in their feed. It was part of an experiment to see how emotions spread on social media. The research found that moods are, in fact, contagious. But the Facebook researcher in charge of the study said, in hindsight, the anxiety the experiment caused may not have been worth doing the study in the first place.
I think that the algorithms of both Facebook and Twitter are designed to promote the angrier stuff. That is, it's one thing to look at the raw data, but it's another to look at what the algorithms of the social media companies prioritize, and they like the anger, they like the contentiousness.
Technology has made us better, faster, and stronger, but Tenner's 2018 book, The Efficiency Paradox, argues that efficiency comes with its pitfalls too.
The efficiency paradox, I'm just going to lift a little bit of it because I want you to talk about this. You say it's an exaggeration to say that Google and the internet makes us stupid, as the technology critic Nicholas Carr argued in an article. But it can help free us from memorization or more creative thinking. It does impact us in that sense, doesn't it? I mean, I talk to so many people that something happens to their phone, they don't know even their own phone number. Everything's in there for them. You don't really have to think. When driving places, you've got the GPS on your phone. Has it changed us in that respect?
Well, I would make a distinction. I think that it might be a better use of our memory not to have everybody's phone number in our memory, to use it for other things. So if we have a limited space for things, it could be and probably is a great thing to be able to offload so much of it to a technological system, to electronic memory. On the other hand, with electronic guidance systems like Waze, there is a risk of people losing a really important intuitive sense of place and what geographers and others call wayfinding, that people in many societies have a really intimate knowledge of their landscapes, are able to get from here to there, really know the terrain, really notice things. And if we don't use a program like Waze properly, and I use it all the time, but if we don't use it properly, then there is a risk of depriving us of a lot of the fun of discovery.
I was at a basketball game, professional basketball game, and there was a couple in front of us, younger couple, and he took pictures of the players and tweeted about it, put it on Facebook, Instagram, whatever. Then he took selfies of himself and his girlfriend, and then he took additional pictures, and then it seemed like the entire game he was taking pictures and tweeting. And so it gets to the question, do we control the devices or do the devices control us now? I mean, are we so involved and immersed in all of this that it's kind of taken over our lives?
The patterns of our lives certainly have been affected by the media. To give you another example, people who are visiting museums now will very often not spend that much time looking directly at the objects, but making a photographic account to share with other people and photographing the same paintings that others have photographed. There is a wonderful photo of visitors to the Mona Lisa, and everybody is craning their cell phones or cameras to photograph the Mona Lisa, and yet you can find a much better professional reproduction of the Mona Lisa in any art book. So there's something very peculiar about the idea that taking a picture of something incorporates it or preserves the memory. So I wouldn't say that machines have taken over or that they're dominating us, but I think that people are using the technology in a number of ways, for example, to forge links with other people, to have people like what you've tweeted or put on Facebook, and then you like what they've done. So it becomes a new medium of social exchange. It's very hard for people who are used to doing that to say, I'm leaving Facebook. So what do they do to communicate with friends? So one or two of my friends who left Facebook for that reason are now sending their comments to mailing lists. And then I see their comments, and then other people on their mailing lists will reply to the points that they would have made. And I could imagine if many people decide to exit Facebook and to communicate with their friends that way, my inbox will fill up with those and with other people's replies to them, and I might start to get nostalgic for Facebook. But it shows how Facebook does respond to a certain kind of need for sharing that no other medium does at this point.
Social media has a darker side too. Cambridge Analytica was a British political consulting firm that illegally acquired personal data from 50 million Facebook users and then supplied that data to the Vote Leave campaign prior to the Brexit vote.
Thank you very much, New Hampshire.
And to Donald Trump's campaign prior to the U.S. presidential elections in 2016. Although there's no official evidence this data breach impacted the elections, some argue that democracy was hijacked.
Are we seeing some incidents, though, where technology is kind of becoming the villain? I mean, Cambridge Analytica, of course, got a lot of press. Did it influence the 2016 election, Brexit? I want to get your thoughts on that.
I have to be skeptical about the damage that is being done by technology, unlike a lot of other technology critics. One reason I have to be skeptical, and I don't really know enough about the specifics and the latest round of research to say. I've seen arguments on both sides. But sometimes when people are denouncing technology, they may be giving it more credit than is really due. So people can actually be paying an inadvertent compliment by saying, "Oh, this is so frighteningly effective." Well, what if it, what if it really isn't? What if it really doesn't do that much good? What if it didn't affect the election? My view is that it really didn't, and that not that we shouldn't have reasons to be concerned, but it can have unintended consequences to be too concerned, because this can only encourage people to develop it further if it's really that powerful.
On the more personal impact of technology, researchers are starting to see signs of people who are feeling more disconnected from others because of the amount of time they spend online. A University of Pennsylvania study found that the more time students spent on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, the more they reported feeling depressed, anxious, or lonely.
I mean, there is something much deeper that happens in face-to-face interaction. There are so many nuances that happen when people are looking at each other as we are now. And you're very often able to detect some kind of reaction that leads you to some other kind of comment. It's more complex. The channel just has so much more information. Likewise, when somebody is actually walking around a place, if they're really observant, they see things, they hear things, they smell things that not always pleasant, but that are going to really stay with them in a way that virtual travel can't. I have always been struck by the silence and isolation of people in cafes. At one point I thought, oh, it's a shame Princeton doesn't have cafes as they had in Europe, where people would go and talk. And I love that kind of life, and sure enough, Princeton did get a cafe, but you walk into it now, and most of the people are just sitting with their laptops and doing work. So it's almost a monastic travesty of what was once a kind of social environment. So I'm not sure if anybody's going to start a conversation-only cafe or something like that, but it does show what we really miss if people are absorbed in electronic cocoons all the time.
Sometimes innovation alone isn't enough. Thomas Edison is renowned for being one of the greatest inventors of all time. He laid the groundwork to bring electricity to people, greatly changing the efficiency of mankind. He filled homes with music and light, but sometimes his creations missed the mark.
Now, when Edison turned to the consumer economy, it was a little different. For example, his phonograph was originally designed for corporate use. It was originally designed for corporate dictation, and only later did he actually discover that its real use was for playing music. He was not originally a consumer-oriented person. So this was one of his few real consumer ventures. But even the expression on the face makes this doll. I mean, if they had space aliens, then this doll would have looked like a space alien. And when you add to that the sound was not very good, that it broke down. So all of them were returned.
So was it like a talking doll?
It was
but it was like a screeching noise.
It was like a talking doll that really made inhuman noises. So the question is why Edison, who was normally such a careful and methodical person, would actually have brought this to the market rather than given it up. And probably Edison scholars have some idea about the answer to that, but I think it may have had something to do with what made Edison so successful, that he was a really stubborn person and he wouldn't say no, and he thought, well, maybe this is not so good, but we're testing the market now, and then on the basis of people's reactions we can develop a better one.
And now there are talking dolls everywhere. So.
Exactly, but this
was bad.
This is an example of how, no matter how great an inventive genius you are, if you're too early because of the other technologies available, it's just not going to work.
Let's go look at some other items.
Sometimes an excellent idea comes before its time.
One of the other things I found interesting talking to you earlier, talking about Thomas Edison, is the way certain inventors or creators think. And they can kind of fall into one column where if they had a broader view, it might help them.
There were lots of editors at the time. Some of them may have been cleverer than Edison, for all I know. But what really impressed me about Edison was the systems thinking, where the generating stations would be placed, how the households would install them, and even something like the wattage, in today's terms, of the lamps. So the early gas jets had illumination equivalent to a 20-watt bulb today, and that's why the first Edison bulbs were 20 watts also, because they wanted to market this to people who were accustomed to this level of lighting. So Edison really had this wonderful imagination of a system that a lot of other inventors didn't. And when other nations will say, well, our guy invented the light bulb, or our guy invented the light bulb, it doesn't really take that much imagination to envision a single technology, but it takes much more imagination to see everything that is going to be necessary to embed that technology in a financially viable network.
I mean, it seems like the electric cars came out in abundance, but people didn't think about the other piece of it, which is probably even more important.
This is what puzzles me about the electric car movement, that everybody is so eager to develop the cars that they forget, well, what is it going to cost for a family of a single family household to have an electrician come and install a special outlet for the car? And then what's going to happen in apartment and condominium complexes that were really not designed around them? So it's this failure to think about the total system, to just imagine that if you build the cars, then people will come along and build those stations, in spite of the fact that a huge investment would be needed to create the kind of national network where people could confidently go from one city to another and go into relatively remote parts of the country, for example, for camping. But the problem there is that it's not really exciting to talk about installing electrical outlets. It's much more exciting to talk about the cars, and that's what journalists have paid attention to.
Self-driving cars, kind of, are we running into the same sort of thing? We do have smart cities that we're seeing crop up in China, where there's the design of the city itself and the roads are just as important as the cars.
Well, that's a very promising idea, and you can certainly do that when you have a city, and that works fine as long as people aren't driving their cars into the countryside, as long as the cars are limited to the city. That's perfectly viable. But the cost of retrofitting anything is typically extremely expensive because it requires a lot of hand labor. And it's not only that, of course, but it's also the nature of so many of the streets and strip malls and the curbs and potholes, which so far the self-driving cars aren't able to see. Ditto animals on the road, very often they're not able to see. So a lot of things that could be avoided by human drivers are still beyond the reach of automated systems, not to mention that sometimes in an emergency you need visual coordination among people, that an algorithm really couldn't do the job. So the self-driving car is one example of a certain kind of technological problem where you have a brilliant system that solves problems 99.99% of the time, but the remaining 1/10 of 1% can really be very, very tough to deal with. And that's something that's very often overlooked when people evaluate these systems.
But when an invention looking to disrupt an industry as crucial as transportation gets it right, well, the results can change the world.
The penny farthing bicycle was one of the fixtures of the 19th century, and there were a couple of very, very interesting things about it. One was how really dangerous it was. So if this had been proposed in the days of product liability lawyers, it would never have been invented. But the strange thing, as historians of technology have discovered about this, was that the danger was part of the attractiveness. That is, it was a way for athletic, well-heeled young men, and you had to be pretty rich because these were very, very expensive. They were as much as a really advanced bicycle today would be. But they were a way for these affluent, sporty young men to show how brave they were, how they could take a risk, because if you encountered an obstacle with this, you could take what was called a header, which could really break your skull. And in spite of this, these were very popular among the people who could afford them. And it was only when new technologies made it possible to go faster with a safer design that the professional racers too, because bicycle racing was also a very popular sport, even the professional racers decided to abandon this older design and to adopt the new one. So I think if we look at the new one, we can see the things that made it successful.
Yes, let's do that. So now when you look at this is from 1896.
Yeah, this is one of the most unusual bicycles ever made. And it proves that bling is universal and not restricted to any one era. It has gold and diamonds and emeralds. And the bicycle, though, also gives us a clue as to why it was so successful in place of the old penny farthing bicycle. And one of the big reasons was the pneumatic tire. So the pneumatic tire made it possible to design a bike with two smaller tires that would be much more stable. The other interesting thing about it, as this design reveals, was that a bicycle was now a unisex technology. So men or women with skirts could ride this model. And also there were new fashions for women, that bloomers that would let them ride more conventional bicycles. So the bicycle also led to a revolution in women's participation in sports and women's clothing. The bicycle was extremely important for early feminism, and it was a symbol of emancipation and mobility. Not only that, but there were studies, I think, in England that showed that the invention of the bicycle actually led to the reduction of birth defects. And the reason for that was that now young people were able to circulate beyond their own village. They could meet other young people who were not so closely related. Oh. So there were unexpected health benefits. I write about negative unintended consequences, but there also have been a lot of positive unintended consequences, and better health was certainly one of them from the bicycle.
And the other thing that's fascinating about this is you look at the bike and you make the point that you could get on this bike and drive around today. I mean, it looks very similar to what today's,
yeah.
And yet the doll that we saw, Edison's clunker, it's evolved and evolved. There are some technologies where they almost get it right off the bat, right?
Yes. Historians call this stabilization. So some things are stabilized at an early stage. For example, smartphones have been stabilized for quite a while. People are talking about folding ones, curved screens, etc. But I'm not sure that that genre will ever change that much just because the present shape is such a good compromise.
Is there one piece of technology as you look towards the future that you're hoping will happen in your lifetime?
A cancer vaccine or a cure for cancer. So that's the really easy one. Beyond that, it's a little harder to say. I would probably say a battery that would allow an electric car to travel as far on a charge, even in cold weather, as a high mileage conventional internal combustion engine does now. I think that would be one of the most transformative things ever.
We'll leave it there. Dr. Tenner, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.